jump into announcements. And this is like this is the first time that I've actually had an announcement like worth announcing on stream. Usually, announcement is like, "Hey, I'm actually streaming like when my schedule says that I'm going to stream." But because of popular requests, a lot of people have asked me to start uploading recordings of my streams, and I started up a YouTube channel today. It's completely empty. This will actually be the first video that goes up on the YouTube channel, more than likely. So I did start a YouTube channel. My streams are going to be located there. I'm going to try to do kind of tutorials and things like that as I go, and hope that that kind of helps a lot of people who are unable to make it on time, because I know a lot of people are a lot of people that follow me on Twitter are from either the West Coast or the East Coast, and the time's messed up for them, or they're in Europe and they're completely asleep. I've actually had several people tell me that they're sleeping when all of my streams go on. So that's what the YouTube channel is for. I'm not going to go super hard on the editing or anything like that because I don't have the time, and it's more for people who weren't able to view the stream. But I will post my channel link in the subscription in the chat. Best thing to do with that is go ahead and subscribe, and I will be updating my Twitter, and will be updating you on my live streams whenever I go and upload something on YouTube. Best way to do it is follow me on Twitter. I put everything on Twitter, so that's probably the best way to find out when I'm uploading something to YouTube or uploading something to my blogs. I also do blogs, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later on, because I do have a blog post that I do want to talk about a little bit. But yeah, that is one of the bigger updates. I did finally jump into the YouTube game, so that's a lot easier than Twitch. You don't have to catch me live. You can watch videos anytime you want. I'm actually currently recording. I turned on the recording as soon as I started talking about the YouTube channel. So that is kind of an explanation of what the YouTube channel is going to be used for. It's going to mainly be used as a backup for my streams, but it's also going to be a way for me to upload tutorials on a case-by-case basis, and hopefully create a different kind of content for YouTube, as well as keep my streams up there. Still working on my OCP. I kind of have my show notes up over here. I'm working on my OSCP. It is a monster in itself. I'm likely to do a blog about that later. So that's kind of been taking up a lot of my time. It's the reason why I haven't done streams as normally as I used to. Last week, I actually specifically did not do a Monday stream because, and I'm going to be totally honest here, politics pissed me off that day, and I could not actually do a stream without being political, and the people that I was going to have on the stream kind of agreed the same way. They were just like, there's no way that we're not going to be able to talk about things that happen in the news that were super political and are likely to get us into trouble. So, that being said, anything that I say on the stream is my own opinion, doesn't reflect that of my employer. I'm not super open about who my employer is either way. But yeah, this is a personal podcast. So yeah, OSCP has been taking up a lot of my time. I kind of detailed this in my blog. I very briefly quit Twitter. I got irritated with kind of the way some people were on Twitter and quit that for a little while. But aside from that, I'm back. I'm keeping things just kind of like updating about my other social media profiles and chatting with people that I think are actually worth networking with. So like I said, that's the best way to keep on top of both my blog posts, my streams, and soon to be my YouTube channel, I guess. So that's about it that I've got in announcements. If anybody's got any questions now, it's a great time to start, because I'm about to start getting into some news and stuff like that. We'll kind of got a question. Oh, Infosec Jesus. That's actually not the first time I've heard that. Going to study for my MCSA, MCSE after my Sec Plus while I'm still in school. Got a decision if I'm going to stick with server 2012 R2 version or the 2016 side. Is there one that you would actually recommend over the other? I know not quite the topic for the stream, but actually value some opinions on it. Honestly, I don't have too much, like technical opinion on that, because I haven't really worked with either of those platforms. I kind of err on the side of the newer, but if it's, something that it doesn't really, if you don't worry too much about the budget and it's that much more expensive, then you're going to have to kind of make it on a, budgetary basis. But I kind of err on the side of the newer just because they've had time to work out the kinks on the newer versions, hopefully, and not introduce a ton of new issues. But that being said, I haven't worked with 2012 R2. I've found a ton of exploits in R2, but not like those are all like you know public knowledge. So yeah, that's totally up to you. I don't really know what your use case is, but props to you for going for like three different certs while you're in school. That's amazing, and nothing that I would have been able to manage. So as a brief kind of introduction to myself, I'm Mitch, Viking Sec, Infosec, Jesus, and a couple of other names that I probably shouldn't say on stream. I am a cyber threat intelligence analyst, and like I said, I can explain a little bit more about what that means if you're not familiar. But I work specifically with cybercrime, and more specifically with Chinese cybercrime. I am fluent in Mandarin. My majors in college, I just graduated like a couple months ago, but my majors were in computer science and Chinese, so I do have a fluency in Mandarin, and I'm currently using that as a means to study the Chinese underground, kind of the underground cyber crime realm. That's led me to, I guess, another announcement that I left off. I will be going to B-Side St. Louis to give a talk on that. I don't know how many of my viewers are in that area, but I will be giving a talk on Chinese cybercrime and fun stuff like that. So if you are in the St. Louis area, I think it's September 1st. You can catch me around there, and I will be giving a talk at B-Side St. Louis about Chinese cybercrime. But that's a little bit about me. I'm going to probably make an actual introduction on YouTube because I kind of feel like that's important. And it'll kind of help other people who don't really know who I am later on. But unless anybody else has some other questions, I'm going to start getting into the news. This stream, I'm going to be talking about news specifically because I think there are a couple of things that I wanted to, touch on right off the bat. I wrote a blog post early on in the week that I'll touch on, the Umbrella Winnti, that's WINNTI post. But I'll go into that a little bit later. But I'll be chatting a little bit about some threat intelligence news. Try not to be overly political towards the end, but I do have a couple of things that I wanted to talk about on that side, and a information security company that happens to have pissed me off this week. So I'm going to try to hold my tongue a little bit on that, but it's kind of a sore subject for me because it seems like it'd be obvious. But we will go into that a little bit further on. So I had first off for news was a Singapore hack. And I didn't actually pick the perfect news article. So let me post one in chat for those of you who aren't super familiar with what's going on. Yeah, there it is. So essentially, Singapore and one of their big health companies got hacked big time by what professionals are saying are a pretty advanced adversary and a nation state or state sponsored or what have you adversary. I'm not entirely sure exactly how true that is. I'm assuming it is because it's a pretty high value target. But they hacked into this healthcare company and stole the records of 1.5 million people. And they said notably they stole the records of the Prime Minister, and I'm not even going to begin to try to pronounce his name because pronunciation in other Asianic languages other than Chinese is way beyond me. But they stole all of this information, and there was a particular quote in there that I wanted to talk about. It was by FireEye's president of the South Asian region, which is kind of cool that they've got that much coverage. Let's see. Yeah, so nation states, this is Eric Ho, the Asia Pacific president of the security company FireEye. Nation states increasingly collect intelligence through cyber espionage operations, which exploit the very technology we rely on in our daily lives. Many businesses and governments in Southeast Asia face cyber threats. This actually isn't the quote that I was looking for by him. Let's see. Eric Ho. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right. But essentially, Eric Ho said that he was worried that the information was stolen for espionage reasons. And I actually hadn't thought of that, when the story first broke. I assumed that PHI or personal healthcare information was stolen for sale on the underground, because that's what I'm exposed to that on a daily basis. PHI goes for pretty big money in the underground, and by that I mean like the dark web, deep net, whatever the hell they're calling it, nowadays. But that was my first assumption, was that it was an attacker who was willing to sell PHI on the underground. And aside from North Korea, I can't think of too many adversaries who would break into healthcare database and sell the data on the underground. That sounds like something that'd be right up North Korea's alley, but there's nothing to kind of corroborate that. But when I read that quote, I was actually kind of interested because, if you read further on in the report, they said that Singapore's prime minister had survived cancer like twice and was in relatively rough health during a certain point. And I started to think, if you steal the healthcare information that, they're saying that they stole about the prime minister, they stole 1.5 million records of names and addresses and healthcare providers, I believe. But specific people, they went in and stole their medication information and their past medical history and things like that. And they said that they stole the prime minister's medical history information. And I thought about that, and I found that really interesting, because obviously that's a scary thing to think about. If you steal enough information from somebody, you can think about different ways that you can poison them, different ways that you can leverage their medical history against them. Like, for example, if somebody contracted an STD or something like that, just something very private, you can use that in blackmail. Well, I kind of wanted to balance the two, because an important part of threat intelligence, or any kind of intelligence, is kind of a risk assessment. You have to assess the risk versus the impact. And I was thinking there are several different countries who may wish to leverage this kind of private healthcare information against the Singaporean prime minister. I'm not discounting that at all. It's very much a possibility, but it's much more likely that this data will go for sale. I just thinking of the different advertisements for personal healthcare information that I've seen just in the last couple of weeks, I would picture a particular actor advertising that they had the health history of the Singaporean prime minister. Like, that would be like a huge thing on the underground. Like, holy crap, I've got all of this, lead data. So I kind of feel like that's a higher probability. But I can't assess that at all. I'm assuming since FireEye commented on it, they probably, I'm not going to say probably, but they may have had actual visibility into the case. I'm not entirely sure of that, but I'm assuming, especially with how widespread FireEye's collections are, they likely had at least some kind of insight into it. But I'm not 100% sure about that. But I'm kind of thinking, the vast majority of adversaries aren't going to be using this for espionage directly. Now, they may sell it to another, third party who's, interested in using it for espionage or blackmail or what have you. But I'm actually, the verdict's still out on that. We don't really, at least from the articles that I read, we're not entirely sure who was actually behind the infiltration, and we're not sure how the data is going to be used. There's actually no telling. So I thought that was interesting. It kind of opened up my mind a little bit more to the ways that PHI can be used. And the sale of PHI is huge. I actually was working on a report for my 9 to 5 about PHI when this story broke, and I was starting to realize just how popular it was for to market in the underground. And I just didn't quite realize how popular it was. It's kind of a scary thing. I don't have anything, I guess, in my medical history that I really care too much about. But you also have to realize that with a lot of these dumps, social security numbers and insurance account information will be sold as well. So you can use that for a whole different kind of fraud, completely outside of the possibility of espionage. So I thought it was interesting. So that's what I was thinking about the Singaporean hack, or the the Singaporean healthcare hack. So I'm going to move on a little bit to, if I have a main topic of the podcast, it's going to be this one because it's kind of my bread and butter. My specialty is Chinese threat intelligence, Chinese cyber threat intelligence. So when this blog post dropped, and I'm going to actually post the original blog post for reference. This was by the 401 Threat Research Group, and they're a blog that I hadn't read before, and they did an amazing job with this particular post. Went into a whole lot of detail. Clearly had worked on it for ages, and I was really impressed by it, and will definitely be watching their publication from now on. But they posted an article about basically the collaboration of Chinese threat actors on the nation state level. And to those of you who aren't super into threat intelligence, you know that different threat actors are going to have different levels of collaboration. So one of the things that hit the news relatively recently was that people started to realize how much infighting there was between Russians' intelligence services, and that's definitely not my area of expertise, so I won't go too far into it. But essentially, there's a whole lot of ambition and butting of heads and infighting between Russians' intelligence services. And then this article went out specifically notifying people about the collaboration between the Chinese intelligence services, and that different threat actor groups that were focused on different targets were actually collaborating, and there was a whole lot of overlap in terms of code reuse, tool use, there was infrastructure and targeting. So you saw a whole lot of collaboration between these services, which was kind of like a stark contrast to the Russian example. But this was something that I kind of probably saw coming. I didn't really vocalize it, but when 401TRG put out their blog post, they specifically detailed a ton of different campaigns that worked together, and kind of the TTPs between those groups, specifically stating that these groups would target gaming companies specifically, and technology companies in general, to steal certificates. And they would also apparently on the side, they didn't go into too much detail on this one, but on the side they would install Ethereum miners, which is hilarious. But they would steal these certificates and use them to sign malware and to use against their primary targets. So essentially they were using these chronologically primary but strategically tertiary targets to use their code signing certificates in the future. And this is something that you could probably have seen coming with the D-Link hack and the certificates that were stolen from D-Link. But they would target these technology companies and use these certificates to sign malware later on. And I'm assuming that's where they first started seeing some major crossover, because there was probably the sharing of these certificates across different threat groups, since they were all associated with Chinese intelligence and Chinese military. So something interesting to note, and I'm going to kind of, there's probably a longer list, but I'm going to go specifically into the fact that Chinese threat groups work together. So I couldn't find like a really good article on the reorganization, but essentially in 2016 there was a reorganization of Chinese intelligence, Chinese military, and specifically the technical teams within the Chinese intelligence and military arms. And essentially what this did was concentrate and bring together and collaborate all of these different disparate arms of Chinese intelligence and Chinese military. And this brought specifically the PLA-3, which were famous in the APT-1 report, and brought all of these different groups under one umbrella. And this is where the Umbrella Winnti name or designation came from. It brought them all together under one umbrella. And they observed these these kind of parallel attacks much earlier. I think they started their collections in like 2009, or their telemetry was dating back until 2009, which is an unbelievable amount of telemetry for a report like this. But during this reorganization, it brought all of these groups under one umbrella so that they could collaborate very closely, and so that they can come under one central command, or a couple of central commands. And this is a pretty common procedure with an authoritarian regime. But to reorganize that large of a bureaucracy took, quite a bit of moving around, and it actually led to a pretty large immigration out of military service, because they actually had a huge military cutback at that point, which, being one of the largest militaries in the world, they could kind of afford that. So with this reorganization came a much more efficient command structure for Chinese intelligence and Chinese military, specifically, PLA 3 and Unit 61. So with this reorganization, you probably had a lot more, collaboration between disparate groups, and that's really important because it's the efficient way to work. If you've got a ton of different groups essentially working for the same cause but in different ways, which is essentially what Chinese intelligence was, and you bring them all together under one roof, they're all going to be able to collaborate. They're all going to be able to spread more efficient TTPs and tooling and certificates and all of that fun stuff and infrastructure. So essentially that's what 401TRG was observing, but they were observing it long before the reorganization. I don't know that they listed any specific metrics that would confirm this theory, but I would bet that they saw more crossover after the reorganization, and I believe it was 2015 and 16 or 2016 and 17. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm wanting to say it's the former. But with this reorganization, there was a whole lot of collaboration between the Chinese intelligence services, and because we're so Russo-centric right now, we're so focused on the Russian threat, we're kind of used to their ambitious infighting and the lack of collaboration, and in fact kind of the adversarial nature of Russian intelligence services. And we're also used to non-state intelligence services like the intelligence services, if you can even call them that, of the terrorist groups, where it's much less organized, and you can you don't see as much collaboration, at least to the scale that you see with China. With China, this 401TRG report actually says that they were able to see TTPs and infrastructure shift across threat actors. So essentially, if threat actor A was targeting Tibetan dissidents, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, if threat actor group A was targeting Tibetan dissidents and threat actor B was targeting Taiwanese dissidents, and you had a commander move from threat actor group A to threat actor group B, then you saw the TTPs that commander imposed move along with it. And they said that because of the depth of their reporting, they were able to observe that live. They if you've got 10 years worth of telemetry, you can observe these TTPs migrate like that. And there was also probably some spread aside from just commanders moving or actors moving, human actors moving. There was actually some spread, so you had people probably talking, well, this is the most efficient way to do this is the best way to do this. So they said that was a particular area of interest for them, where they started to see migration across different threat actor groups, and that's how they kind of started to tie them together, aside from the code reuse and different technical indicators like infrastructure reuse and things like that. So some things that I wanted to highlight is that collaboration between threat actor groups in China is a very good indicator of it being a state-sponsored group, which is an important designation, especially for the feds. They really like to call everything nation state, even though it's probably some dude in a basement. But aside from that, it's important to note in terms of capability, because obviously nation state groups or state sponsored groups are much more capable than others, and they're going to have different sets of targeting. So we're going to talk a little bit about the targeting of dissidents, and I think that that is a very China thing. And I mentioned that in a blog post. I'm going to post the link to the blog post later on after I'm finished talking about this subject. But the targeting of dissidents seems to be, Russia does it to an extent, but they don't do it as famously as China does. Like Russia puts a bullet in the back of somebody's head, or slip something in their tea that makes them glow green and die in a hospital. But China has been targeting dissidents with cyber attacks for quite a long time. I believe I remember the APT1 report actually had a blurb about them targeting dissidents. And by dissidents, I mean there are dissident journalists, there are political activists, and things of that nature. Essentially, anybody who disagrees with the central party line is considered a dissident in China, and they're targeted with state-sponsored cyber attacks. Now, we've all seen the news. One of the most powerful intelligence communities and one of the most powerful militaries in the world, in the U.S., isn't able to withstand a whole lot of state-sponsored cyber attacks. Try being a journalist, a non-technical journalist. That's Alexander. Thank you so much for the donation. You the bomb. But think about a journalist, a non-technical journalist, who is speaking out against the Chinese regime and is targeted by state-sponsored assets. One of the most well-funded and powerful militaries in the world is putting their money towards targeting journalists and like older people and like all of this awful stuff. If we can't handle it as one of the most powerful intelligence communities in the world, how are you going to expect some random non-tech journalist to do it? How are you going to expect some kind of somebody who left China in fear for their life and fled to either Taiwan or to Australia or any of these other places? You can't expect that level of operational security and technical knowledge that would be required in order to fend off a state-sponsored attack. So it really is unbelievable, that they're aiming for the U.S., they're aiming for Europe, they're aiming for NATO countries, they're aiming for India, they're aiming for just about anybody else on the list. They're setting their sights on those countries, but they're also aiming against some extremely low-hanging fruit when you think about it, in terms of technical knowledge at least. So that highlights a couple of things. A, China is not 100% aiming for intelligence assets. They're not looking for nuclear codes or network layouts of U.S. research institutes. They're not looking for blackmail information against Donald Trump. I mean, that's obviously out there. But they're aiming for all of those things on top of aiming for people who just simply disagree. This is anybody from your average journalist who just doesn't want to write for, somebody like, Chinese state-sponsored news like Xinhua. They want to talk about the things that they disagree with on South China Morning Post. It's kind of it's a scary thing to think about, where this is one of the most powerful cyber armies, if you want to use the buzzword, one of the most powerful cyber forces in the world right now, and they're targeting people for disagreeing. They're targeting dissidents, and that very much shows the importance of the psychological game. This idea of you're not powerful enough to resist the regime. You're not powerful enough to fight against the power. So there's a psychological effect where if you're thinking about becoming a dissident or thinking about writing for a dissident, news outlet, you better think different, because you've got one of the most powerful intelligence communities in the world targeting you simply for disagreeing. And there's also a secondary, portion to that where, it almost helps defenders, because as a defender, if you're researching a piece of malware and you see somebody upload it from Tibet, and you do a little bit of research, a little bit of open source research, and reach out to somebody, you find out that it's just some random older blogger based out of Taiwan or based out of Tibet who happens to have a very controversial opinion of the Chinese Communist Party. And you're like, holy crap, I'm pretty sure I can tie this to the Chinese regime. I mean, there's a level of hacktivism in China, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's not 100%. But, there's this kind of, ability for you to look at it and say, well, if this person can be considered a dissident and they're targeted with a relatively technical attack, we can probably assume at least that it's a Chinese state-sponsored attack. So there's two sides to the coin, I guess, but the kind of part that I wanted to highlight was the very China-ness of targeting dissidents, people who are that oppose the party, or people who have really unpopular opinions in terms of the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think the MSS has you on a list? I hope I'm famous enough for that, but right now I've got 15 viewers on Twitch, and I don't think they're very fond of Fortnite, so I don't even know if they've heard of the platform that I'm on. But, chances are I'm on some kind of list. There's no telling. I'd be honored, I guess. But I considering the publications that I've put out, both on my blog and on Twitter and now on my stream, I don't ever plan on visiting that country again for very obvious reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of scary to think about. It's the power scale comparison between the Chinese Communist Party and their online abilities, and them targeting largely non-technical journalists. But that kind of also highlights the importance of teaching hygiene and basic technical knowledge to people who may not need it in their 9 to 5, or may not think that they need it in their 9 to 5. I know several journalists who are very technical, Chris Being, and a lot of the guys from Vice Motherboard and things like that. A lot of them are extremely technical journalists, but I kind of feel like that it's almost a necessity as a journalist, especially one who might or might not end up, speaking truth to power. It might be very important for them to learn at least the basics of a VPN, or the basics of encryption and things like that. So it sucks that we've kind of entered a world where that's necessary, but I also kind of think of it as a necessary evil. Maybe we do need to start, we definitely do need to start educating the masses on cyber hygiene and things like that. But I guess that's in itself could be a blog post, honestly. So I had that as a highlight for Umbrella Winnti. So I went into more detail on my blog, and I will post the link to my actual article on there. We should all learn Kung Fu. Kung Fu's alright. I don't hate it. It's a good martial art, but most people in China honestly don't know it. It's not nearly as popular as people make it out to be. But yeah, that's the link to the blog post that I had on the Umbrella Winnti group. I would highly recommend the article first. I linked to it in the blog post, but definitely read the article first. It's a really, really great report. They also published a ton of IOCs on GitHub, and the actual blog post itself that are really going to help researchers in the future, and I definitely made note of it myself. But I mean, it was like a ridiculous amount of IOCs just targeting Chinese, I think Chinese state-sponsored threat groups in general. But it really is a great blog post. I would recommend reading it, and then read over mine for kind of my thoughts on it. So I'm gonna now get into a part that's gonna get me in trouble. CIA will not follow you anywhere if you know Kung Fu. I wish it were that easy. So I'm gonna post a link to this article. You're not gonna have time to read it because it's long and pointlessly long. But I kind of went on like a miniature rant on Twitter about this before, and basically it was an article published by UpGuard, which is a company that I've honestly never heard of before. They might be a really high-end kind of information security company, but I hadn't heard of them before. But this was brought to my attention by one of the FSD guys. They posted a link to it in chat, and essentially it is UpGuard pontificating about this incredible leakage that they found in one of their clients, or no, I think it was a third-party infrastructure. Essentially, they found an rsync server that had a whole lot of ICS data, and ICS being industrial control systems, and all of this data included a bunch of customer data and NDA contracts and information about third and fourth parties and all of this different stuff. And right off the bat, they said that it was 157 gigabytes of exposed data, including 10 years of information. A bunch of SCADA stuff, not SCADA stuff, but different like blueprints for robotics and schematics and all of this sexy looking stuff. Now here's where I have a problem. They, in the first paragraph, not only name and shame the company that supposedly left this information public, but name and shames their customers, including VW, Chrysler, Ford, Toyota, GM, Tesla, and ThyssenKrupp. So here's my problem. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I'm okay with naming and shaming under certain circumstances. If you're going to be an absolute charlatan, as we like to call it in the community, but just like an absolute moron and push snake oil to people and basically fight a war against facts, then you deserve to be called out and dragged through the mud in what has become an extremely hostile community on Twitter. And you deserve to go through that. But if you left a server online on accident, I don't think that it's immediately necessary to name and shame that group. I don't think that's, there are different factors that go into that. So if you're a company like, let's say Panera, you're a company that decided to leave their API completely open in the internet and left a ton of customer data up there, and somebody notifies you of this, and you say, oh, it's been patched, there's no reason to go anywhere forward. You don't pay the person who submitted the bug, you don't pay attention to the person, and you didn't actually patch it. This is pretty much a brief discussion on Panera too, I guess. But that company was given multiple chances, including legitimate responsible disclosure by several different researchers. They were dragged through the mud in a semi-public basis, whereas they started spreading the word in closed groups and DMs and things like that. And then they were absolutely dragged through the mud after they refused to actually respond to it. They left all of this customer data online, API calls, all of that fun stuff, and it was very easily mitigated. And essentially they ignored the problem. They wouldn't pay out like they said that they would, and they ignored every other researcher who said they should patch it. That's a different story. That person deserves to get dragged. Panera deserved what came to them. They absolutely got dragged. People created scripts to scrape the Panera database, in order to, prove that they were able to get customer data. Yeah, so just fired up my Spotify, damn near blew myself out of chair on the differential. You're super low volume. That's weird. I actually just got a new mic. I don't know why it would be low volume, but I've got it turned all the way up. Let me see if I can change it a little bit. Is anybody else having problems? I've got 2 people saying that it's low. Let me see if I can turn it up. But yeah, there's a certain level that you have to reach in order to be, my OBS broadcast level is very low. That's weird, because I've got it, yeah, I don't really know how I would fix that. Let me see if it's coming through low on my end. Weird. Yeah, it's coming through fine on my end at least. That's really weird. I know WebEx has a bad habit of lowering your mic level if you have application control enabled for the mic. I don't really know what the problem would be. Let me mess with that while I talk. But, essentially Panera dealt with it in 30 different ways that were wrong. And, they deserve to get dragged through the mud. These several companies, very large, big name companies, they weren't really given that chance, it seems like. And there are 3 sides to every story, and I don't know every side of this, but it kind of seems like they weren't really given a chance to kind of responsibly deal with it without them going completely public on it. Um, it really sucked to see, and it really, irritated the hell out of me because, it's kind of like I don't really see why that was the way they decided to do it. And UpGuard published a ton of information that, this is kind of my main point. A lot of the information they published, I can't help but feel like it didn't help anybody. Basically, it was a pat on the back from UpGuard's side. They were able to say, look at all of these big companies, these big name companies that we've got as our client. And, look at this big help that we did them. Look at all of this information we were able to pull off of, the server. And it just kind of seemed like it helped their marketing a whole lot by saying, hey, look at all of our big clients. You should really go with us because of all of, these big names that trust us. But it wouldn't have helped the defenders at all. They didn't give, specific mitigation techniques. They didn't really give much information that would help the defender. And they gave a whole lot of information that, quite frankly, would have put their customers at risk. If I were an attacker who was specifically interested in ICS, I would see, okay, somebody left an RCS or an rsync server online, and it had all of this important information, and here's the file structure, and if I'm focused on this particular information, this is they basically posted not a how-to guide, because I'm sure it was relatively complicated to actually, traverse all of this. I'm not super familiar with the technical side of it, because they didn't give much, technical information about it. But they essentially gave the attackers a target to aim for. And it pushed me the wrong way, and it pushed a lot of other people in the industry the wrong way, because the information they published wasn't helpful for any defender. It was really helpful for an attacker. It painted a target on their customer's back, and it painted a target on everybody else's back. And it kind of seemed like the antithesis of an actual responsible disclosure. So it pushed me the wrong way. I went off a little bit about it on Twitter, and discussed it with a couple of other people. It really irritated me, because it seems like that's kind of like the fame whoring side of information security, and I didn't really understand the purpose of it. I'm assuming UpGuard is a bigger information security company, is considering the the people that they had in the blog post, and they're a research company or what have you. But it seemed incredibly unprofessional. It seemed incredibly dangerous, from the perspective of helping out the attacker, and it really didn't help the information security industry as a whole. And that really it pushed me the wrong way. I don't know. I won't go too long into that, because honestly I could rant about that for a while. But does anybody have any questions or thoughts about that? I don't know how many of you actually read the article before I posted it in chat. Major Ursa, I'm drinking Jameson Irish whiskey. I didn't go for anything super hipster or weird or anything like that. I actually just finished off a bottle of Monkey Shoulder Scotch, which is like my go-to Scotch. It's delicious, but I opted for easy and simple Jameson. Crown's not bad, Alexander. I've had it a couple of times. I really like Crown Vanilla, because if you mix that with Coke, it's literally just like vanilla Coke and super dangerous. Yeah, I like Jameson. I don't like it near as much as I like the Monkey Shoulder Scotch. But yeah, that's what's to drink tonight. If you're just now joining us from anywhere else, this, like I said, super informal stream where I pretty much have a different kind of whiskey every other stream, and usually I have a cigar with me too. Yeah, if you guys have any thoughts on anything that I've talked about, I've touched on the a little bit about the UpGuard stuff, the Umbrella Winnti stuff, and the Singaporean healthcare hack. I had some bullet the other night at a speakeasy. It was some old shit, like $18 a shot. So good though. I'm not huge on bullet whiskey, I guess. Maybe I'm weird on that, but because I've met a lot of people who like it. But yeah, it's not really my thing. Yeah, if you guys have any thoughts, I'm going to actually move on to a different subject that I'll probably rant about for a lot longer than I did the UpGuard crap. But I want to talk a little bit about ZTE. And if you've been following me on Twitter or have talked to me on Slack or DM or in real life or anything else, you probably know that I have extremely strong opinions on ZTE. And if you don't know what that situation is, ZTE is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, telecom companies in the world. They're a Chinese-based company, and they produce anywhere from phones to backbone server technology and routers and things like that. So, the big controversy is that way back, I can't remember exactly when, ZTE and Huawei, which is their direct competitor, also a Chinese company, were being investigated by the Federal Exchange Commission, the FEC, I believe. I want to say that's right. They were under investigation, A, because they wanted to enter the U.S. market, and B, because they had a couple of sketchy things going on at the time that the FEC thought was necessary to investigate. This was right around the time where stuff was kicking off for the first, second, or third time with North Korea and the first, second, or third time with Iran. And it was discovered that ZTE was violating sanctions by selling to Saudi Arabia, Iran, and North Korea, all while I believe all three of them were under sanction. So that kicked off in a big way. We were talking fines and barring them from the U.S. market. And while all this was going on, the Intel guys were like, what the hell are you talking about barring them from the U.S. market? They're not coming in the U.S. market. And people got a little bit surprised by that. They said, well, we've got all of this other Chinese stuff. I mean, Chinese stuff is, everywhere from phones to microwaves to TVs and couches. Like, why aren't we letting this company in? They seem like it'd be a good company. Well, they said, well, we've been tracking malware coming from ZTE for a long time. Same thing with Huawei. And that began the debate. All of a sudden, everybody was like, well, what the hell malware are we talking about here? Like, we haven't seen any information about it. There wasn't anything in open source. We assumed that everything was already closed source. But even a couple of the Intel guys were wondering what they were talking about. And they got into this discussion of sources and methods, and this discussion of, should we push information about, the ZTE stuff and make it public, or should we keep our cards hidden? It being a pretty high-profile case like that, where we're talking about billions, if not more, in revenue for ZTE by barring them or letting them into, the U.S. market, everybody was really pushing for the IC to release information. And as far as I've seen, they haven't. Essentially, they're saying, trust us, ZTE is a bad actor, and if we allow them to come into the U.S. market, they're going to push into the backbone infrastructure area, and they're going to essentially backdoor our critical infrastructure, and we're going to be screwed. And that's, a hugely scary possibility. And considering China's bad actions in the past by stealing anything from, wind technology to, fighter jet technology, I kind of understand where they're coming from. I tend to trust the IC. There are a whole lot of experts working for the IC with access to information that we should not ever see, and information that we may or may not end up seeing in the future. And, I tend to err on the side of trusting the IC on this because A, and it may be confirmation bias, but I'm kind of used to the knowledge of China doing sketchy stuff and trying to be, evasive and things like that. And B, it fits standard Chinese TTPs. I mean, using economic means to subvert cyber and using cyber means to subvert economic means. I mean, that's a very China thing to do, I guess. So, it kind of fit everything that I was seeing, in open source or in, the research that I had done. And also, it's kind of in the US's interests, economically at least, to let ZTE in. We would benefit from cheaper infrastructure technology, and we would benefit from more diversity in the marketplace, technically or theoretically. So, it would make more sense for us to be okay with, this company entering the market. Like I said, we had tons of, Chinese companies in the market already. Why not let it be, core infrastructure or telephones or telecom or what have you. So, I trusted the IC because they were kind of going against US's best interests, and there really wasn't that much of a prerogative for, false flagging this one. It makes much more sense for them to be telling the truth about this, because that'd be a complicated and kind of pointless lie to tell. So basically, without going too far into my thoughts on that side of it, I trusted the IC when they said that they had reason to believe that ZTE was a bad actor. There's also something that people may or may not understand and probably don't understand in the correct way. Private companies in China work differently. Private companies in China, which is still a very new idea, to be a private company in China is you're kind of on the bleeding edge economically there. To be a private company in China, you have to bow down a whole hell of a lot to the Chinese Communist Party. And with that has come a whole lot of nastiness. Like, for example, Google, like arguably the world's biggest company in terms of anything tech. When they moved to China, I mean, they immediately bent over and bowed down to the CCP. When the CCP said, we're not going to let Google in China unless they give away user data, they were like, okay, well, we're not going to fight this, we're just going to leave. When Apple went over, it was even worse. They bent over and said, okay, you can have all of, Chinese citizens' data. Here it is on a silver platter, and, the chances are they probably footed the price for it. So, if Apple and Google are willing to bow down to their Chinese communist overlords, then you got to think that a Chinese or a China-based company is going to do the same thing. If you're given relative economic freedom to be a private enterprise in China, you're going to be giving something up somewhere along the way. So with that has come a very, very gray area in Chinese private enterprise. And by gray area, I mean you're either a private citizen who is being forced to bow down to the Chinese Communist Party and everything that you do. If you're a tech company, that means you're allowing the Chinese Communist Party a backdoor into all of your data, a backdoor into all of your software, all of your source codes and things like that. They have access to everything, right off the bat. It's not a question. If you're not a Chinese private citizen, it's because you're either current or former PLA, People's Liberation Army, or you're current or formal Chinese Communist Party. And if you're currently part of the party, you're again forced to bow down to their will. If they say jump, you jump. If they say bow, you bow. If they say give all of your user data over, you give all of your user data over. Now, theoretically, that only applies to data that is physically in China. I don't think it's going to work out like that practically. I get the feeling that if the Chinese Communist Party tells you, hey, we know that these servers storing user data are located in the US, and we know that they probably don't contain any information about, Chinese citizens, but you're going to hand it over anyways because you're a Chinese citizen, and you're either a member of the Communist Party, a member of the PLA, or you're going to do it anyways because there really isn't such a thing as a private enterprise. It's all kind of a farce to appear like they're becoming more moderate and less communist. Essentially, they're trying to take advantage of the capitalist system and the private enterprise system without actually becoming capitalists, without becoming democratic. Basically, they're using capitalism in the same way that they're using democracy. They're saying, oh, there's a vote. You can go to your local prefecture and vote. And you can vote for your local officials and all of that. But you're not going to be able to vote for your actual, federal representatives. That's chosen by your local prefecture. And your local prefecture, the Chinese Communist Party is going to have a say of who is actually on the ballot. So they're taking democracy and bastardizing it, for lack of a better term, to basically get all of the benefits of a democracy without all of the giving over of control and fun stuff like that. So they're doing the same thing with capitalism. They're taking the capitalist system and saying, well, we want private enterprise because it seems to be doing really well for technology specifically. Research and development is booming because of, the capitalist system or the private enterprise system. So they said, we're going to allow for that, but we're not giving over control. We're going to allow you to develop your own company and become entrepreneurs and have this awesome, technological enterprise, but we're not going to let you have it be your own thing. we're going to have control over the data at all times, the access at all times, the source code at all times. And if you say any different, then your business disappears or somebody else is installed as a CEO. So, when all of that comes back to ZTE, people say, "Oh, ZTE is a private company. It's not a state-owned enterprise." China, they privatized all of these different things. They're a private enterprise country now. They're capitalist. They're democratic. No, that's not how it works. And if you've studied China for any length of time, especially modern China, you know that it's not it's not a private enterprise system any more than it is a democracy. It's they're taking advantage of the good parts without giving up the control. So what that means for ZTE is that there was a discussion of private enterprise versus state-owned enterprise. And they said that because that ZTE is a private enterprise, they're not controlled by the state. And that's just simply not how it works. ZTE is a private enterprise, but they are owned by the state. They're not a state-owned enterprise, but they're owned by the state. That's kind of how the Chinese form of the Chinese form of capitalism works. You are still a state-owned enterprise, even if it doesn't have the name on it. So it's just a different way of flowing the money, essentially. So what that means is that ZTE is essentially a state-owned enterprise, and when you give a state-owned enterprise access to your market, you're essentially giving the state access to your market. It's not, giving control of or giving access to the market to a private industry that has private industry interests. You're giving it over to a state-owned enterprise that has state-owned interests. Do you see what I mean? It's a completely different idea. So if Google goes over to China, they're not necessarily going to be against U.S. interests, but they're going to be very, very much for Google's interests. They're interested in their bottom line. They're interested in their ability to make money and their ability to conduct research and development in China and access the Chinese market. And if that aligns with the U.S. interests, or if the U.S. is able to exert some kind of legal control over Google, in order to leverage that, okay, that's a different matter. But at its core, Google is going to serve their own interests. ZTE is not. ZTE is going to be interested in profits. They're going to be interested in marketing, but that does not come before the Chinese state, because they know that their doors close the second they stop serving up data, the second they stop serving up access. So it's different. You can't expect a state-owned enterprise to be acting for private interests because they have the name private interest group or the name private enterprise on it. So that's kind of my core point. If you're allowing ZTE access to the American market, you're allowing China access to the American market. And you're not allowing it in a controlled way like you do through trade. You're not allowing it in a controlled way like you do on a case-by-case term. You're allowing it in a very open way where you're saying, okay, we're going to allow you to sell phones. All right, you're only allowed to sell phones. There's a whole hell of a lot of data that China can pull from having Chinese phones in America that they have direct access to. It's different. We're not talking about Huawei phones. Huawei phones are already in America, and I will never come near one. If you've got a Huawei phone, at a party that you're at with me, just set it down across the room, or I'll probably throw it in your beer. But it's different. It's very, very different when we're talking about allowing direct access of ZTE to our our market. You're not dealing with the same idea as you would with a European company or something like that. It's just different. You've got to recognize it being different, and that's one of my problems that I had early on, was that they were allowing China to pull the wool over their eyes and saying that it's a private enterprise. It's not a state-owned enterprise. This is different. We're not giving the Chinese state direct access. It's completely different, and you are giving the Chinese state direct access to the U.S. market. And that should be something that you should worry about, because they're going to use that for their advantage naturally. If the U.S. had a state-owned enterprise, which wouldn't work under the U.S. system, but if the U.S. sent a state-owned enterprise over to China, you would expect a tiger to act like a tiger. A U.S. company, a U.S. state-owned company, is going to work for U.S. interests. That's just how it works. You're going to work for the interests of your owners. and ZTE is owned by China, whether they call themselves a state-owned enterprise or not. So that was my primary argument, but there was, a very long series of debates between, people in the IC and people who don't know better. And unfortunately, the people who don't know better were louder, and they were talking about the benefits to the US market and all of this fun stuff. And essentially they won. ZTE was slapped with a massive fine. I can't remember the actual figures, but they were slapped with a pretty damn big fine, but they are essentially being allowed in the US market. I'm not going to make these, FUD kind of statements about the effect that that's going to have on the US and the immediate series of, exercises that are going to happen. Yeah, it was almost $1 billion. It was an obscene kind of fine. But I won't go into the, fear mongering or anything like that, but it is a big deal. It's something to pay attention to. It's scary from my perspective because I've studied China and the way that they work, in terms of espionage and in terms of, just the general Chinese threat. And it's something that the average citizen should be worried about just as much as the intelligence community should. Because at the end of the day, you're the one holding the phone. You're holding a microphone, a video camera, and a GPS locator, all in one, with all of your social media accounts on it, all of your bank account information on it, all of your private details and your text messages on it. You're the end user. And this is something that hasn't gotten enough attention by the end users, the average person. The IC has been talking about it for a long time. The threat intel company and the Chinese circles have been talking about it for a long time. But, it hasn't really reached the end user enough. And that worries me because those are the people who are going to see a pretty big impact. They're going to be targeting the IC, but they're going to be targeting the end user and gathering data about the end user just as much. And, for somebody like me, who is an end user of telephones, and, who has their data out there and has crossover with the intelligence community and the threat intelligence community, that worries me a whole lot. I was hoping that the intelligence community was going to be able to speak loud enough to keep this decision from going through, but it doesn't seem like that worked. And, it worries me a whole hell of a lot. And 706B30 posted a Daily Beast article that I actually believe that I've read before. That there's a whole lot about this case that is just extremely China. Like, for example, Major Ursa said that especially because once they were told they were being sanctioned, they said they would comply, but blatantly different and didn't. Yeah, they just, essentially looked at it dead in the face and said, yeah, you don't want us marketing to Korea. Well, we're just going to do it under the sheets. I believe I read that they covered up boats full of, like, telecom technology and just, like, sailed them across the river and gave them to North Korea, and just, it was like almost like a Black Ops mission or something. Like, it was unreal, the way that they evaded these sanctions, and we finally caught them, but it didn't do us any good. It's amazing that we were able to catch them so red-handed, yet still allowed them to enter our market and allowed them to put their devices in our homes. That it worries me on a lot of different levels. In terms of politically, right now we're worried about Russian interference, and we've got good reason to worry about Russian interference and subversion and espionage. But I kind of feel like that Russocentrism has taken us away from the Sinocentric threat. We're focusing a whole hell of a lot on Russia right now, and that's really good for people who are experts on Russia. They're finally people are paying attention to this matter. And you could take that one of two ways. Either, people are paying attention to it and that's good, or people are paying attention to it and they're getting it completely wrong. And I've talked to several people who have different opinions on that matter, but, the people who are worried about China are more worried now than they have been before. Not just because the Chinese threat has stepped up, not just because we're looking at a more advanced Chinese threat than we were last year, last 5 years especially, last decade especially. We're worried because people aren't focusing on it, because they're getting tunnel vision about the Russian threat. They're getting tunnel vision like, they did with, the counterterrorism threat. The same thing can be said. We were really, really focused on the Cold War threat, and then terrorism happened. We were really, really focused on the counterterrorism threat, and then Russia happened. I'm really, really worried that we're going to get very, very focused on the Russian threat, and we're going to ignore Iran, we're going to ignore terrorism, we're going to ignore China. And 706 said it right. China must love the distraction that Russia is causing. They really must. And that's what worries me. They're sitting there acknowledging that we're not nearly as focused on the Chinese threat as we probably should be, and we really should be. But I won't get too far into kind of my fears for that because I've already talked about it for probably like 30 minutes or something. So we talked about UpGuard and their ridiculous disclosure. We talked about ZTE. A whole lot has gone on with the Russia investigation. I'm sure everybody here has read about it. I'm not going to go too far into my opinions on it because I think they should be obvious. Anybody with any kind of common sense should be really angry right now and be really curious as to what's going to go on in the next couple of weeks. Carter Page in particular, I think that he's probably going to get buried very, very soon. Not buried like literally, like I probably shouldn't say that on stream, but like buried, like he will probably end up in a very small cold cell very soon, and I hope that he does. That's at least one that we can knock off and say that we checked that box. But there's been a lot of argument going on that I think is just 100% illogical, and I won't go too far into it just because it doesn't really deserve grandstanding. But make sure you're paying attention to the Russian stuff. I'm not saying that you should just ignore all of the Russian crap and focus on China. We need to grow as a community, especially threat intelligence, and just in general as Americans. We need to be able to focus on multiple things at once because we're really bad at that. We need to be able to focus on terrorism, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, anybody else who might pop up in the future. For some reason, we just don't have the ability to focus on everybody at the same time. So, I will say watch the Russian space, read the, I think it's like 418-page FISA document that was released about Carter Page. I haven't read it yet myself, but, it probably is worth a read if you're actually following that. Pwn the Things on Twitter has been talking about it a ton, and anything that he posts, I trust it because, he seems to be, for some reason, the foreign expert on American politics that knows more about American politics than 99% of Americans do. So watch the news with an open mind. Discuss things with people with an open mind. Have the ability to talk to people logically without inserting your emotions into it. And that's all I'll say on the matter. I will, ambassador the John Bolton, that moron that we somehow put in office, decided to spout out about Iran, and so did our president, who we also put in office somehow. Spouted off about Iran, like literally as I was starting the stream, I believe. Essentially insinuating once again that we were going to go to war with Iran for being mean on Twitter. Just try to put yourself above it all. I don't say that to say like, you're better than anybody else or anything like that, but put yourself above it all so that you can talk about it logically from a top-down perspective instead of putting yourself emotionally into the middle of it all. That's been the only way that I've been able to keep sane and probably keep my job, is so I can look at this from an objective perspective instead of inserting my own opinions on it, because I have a lot of opinions on it, but that's not what this podcast is for, I guess. Acidice? What is this? Dude, don't you work in Stop and Stop? Okay, I don't know who this guy is, but he seems fun. Acidice 888 seems like a blast. But yeah, I'll probably be calling the podcast here, unless, I always kind of try to give people an opportunity to ask questions, during the entire podcast, but as well as at the end specifically, so that I can answer questions in long form. So if you guys have any questions, if you want to ask about my opinions on anything, feel free. I may or may not answer them just because, I might be a little bit more inflammatory than I probably need to. But, you guys feel free to ask questions, anything threat intelligence related, China related, whiskey related, cigars related, I don't care. But this is y'all's opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to switch on some music until I get a couple of questions in, if I can pull up Spotify. So I'll give it about like 5 minutes probably. Well, I guess I probably shouldn't pull up music because I'm worried about like takedowns and stuff like that. But yeah, you guys feel free to ask questions about anything threat intel related. I've answered a couple of questions a couple of times, but I'm hoping that's what the YouTube channel will help. I'm going to put this episode up as the first episode on YouTube. So if you guys don't have any questions, I'm going to give a couple of people shout outs for follows and donations and subscriptions. So after I give shout outs for that and you guys don't have any more questions, then I will probably end the stream there. So thank you to